Okay, thank you. Okay, so once again, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yes, we've got Professor Jon Stone with us. I'm going to read out my what I've written down again. So Jon Stone, a Professor of Neurology in Edinburgh, who has been doing research on FND for 25 years and created the Neurosymptoms FND Guide. We'll talk through where we've been with FND, where we are, and where we are going. And once again, at the end of the talk, there will be a questions and answers. Thank you, Jon, so much for joining us this evening. I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you tonight, and hopefully the talk will show why that is, partly because of where and how minimal anything to do with FND was, how invisible it was. And it really gives me a huge pleasure to see 200 people on this call tonight, because every year I think there's just more and more people and more awareness and interest. So it's really exciting. I'm going to aim for about 25 minutes, something like that, 30 minutes. I don't want to talk too long. Everyone will get sleepy this time of night. And I think the discussions are obviously, and the questions are often some of the best bits. So, but I thought I would give you a sort of my overview anyway of FND past, present, and future. I know you've had that. That's been a sort of theme through the day, and everyone has a different perspective. So I hope you find it interesting. I hope there's something for everyone, and I hope you can see my screen and hear me all right. So yeah, as Mandy said, I'm a neurologist here in Edinburgh, and I got into this area in the late 1990s, which I'll come to. So anyway, I just thought I'd clear up what is a functional disorder, because FND is one of the disorders of brain function. And the opposite of a functional disorder is a structural disorder. So I just thought I'd say that, because people often get confused about that. So we're talking about a disorder of brain software very broadly. I have quite a lot of migraine. I regard that as one of my functional disorders that I have. That's a bit of a controversial view to some neurologists, but not to me. And if you're not into software and hardware, it's like a piano that's out of tune rather than something that's broken or something you can see on a scan. So that's very broadly what a functional disorder is. And when we're talking about FND, we're talking about the kinds of symptoms to a neurologist. So weakness, tremor, paralysis, seizures, etc. Maybe dizziness and cognition. People with FND, lots of people with FND on this call, you'll recognize a lot of these other symptoms: chronic pain, fatigue. They're not strictly FND, but they're very common associated symptoms. So if we go back in time, FND is not a new thing. So you can open up a textbook of neurology from the 1890s, and you'll see lots of pictures of people with FND symptoms that I see now. And in fact, that's one of the remarkable things about it, is how consistent it's been across time. It was called hysteria in the 19th century, which tells us about its very stigmatized history. And so although that was a disorder, particularly of women, there was also men described with it as well. And in fact, at that time in the 19th century, neurology and psychiatry wasn't as split as it is now. There was a lot of actually very interesting and relevant research went on into this condition, even though it went under the banner of this name that I dare not even say the H word, but that's how it was. And when we got to World War I, it was very much in the public eye, because when we think about soldiers in World War I, and I'll show you one a bit later, with shell shock, many of them had FND. So many of them had a mixture actually of minor physical injuries, but major neurological symptoms like paralysis or seizures, which took their basis in a functional disorder, a software problem of the brain, not actually a hardware problem. I'm giving you, this is really racing through history here, but after World War I, what happened was that the ideas of Sigmund Freud really took hold, and you probably had some of this from FND Portal earlier. And FND became a purely psychological condition, got the sort of psychiatric manual here. And this view sort of held sway really for 100 years. So Freud thought that FND, and not just Freud, but people thought, well, this is a disorder that's very firmly a psychiatric one. Patients with FND symptoms, what's happening is that they have had some sort of conflict going on in their mind. They are suppressing the conflict and converting it into a physical symptom, like paralysis. And that symptom was thought to be symbolic of the conflict that they were experiencing. So this was the heyday of psychoanalysis, and this was basically this is what I read when I opened a book in 1995 reading about this. This was the idea that was dominant. And we'll come back to this later, because I don't want to sort of say that absolutely everything that went on in the 20th century was wrong. I don't think it was. I would say I've even met patients where this narrative and the idea about conversion disorder actually works, and some of you might feel that way about your condition as well. But as I'll go on to say, this is just one perspective amongst many perspectives involving the brain and the mind, which we now have with FND. So we had this very narrow one, and it was particularly problematic because people with FND go to see neurologists, they're diagnosed by neurologists, and what was happening for most of the 20th century was that the neurologists were just saying, not my problem, goodbye. And they weren't even often just actually sending patients. So this is me in 20 years ago with my wife and our 2 kids at the time, who are now 21 and 19. And that was me when I just finished my PhD in FND. I was very fortunate to be able to do that because it was such a invisible topic. I was very fortunate to find 2 people, Charles Waller and Michael Sharp in Edinburgh, willing to supervise me. So what were things like back then? And I think it's really important to say this is the recent past, and then for many people this is the current. This is how things are. I know, and depending how old your doctor is, they may actually behave like this, because this is how things were 20 years ago when I was training. This was the mainstream approach that we were taught as neurologists to, when people had FND, to say, well, good news, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing on the scan, it's a psychological problem, your tests are normal, and maybe I'm going to refer you to somebody, but more often your tests are normal, goodbye. That was the most common sort of approach. And it's remarkable, really, when I look back, that neurologists thought this was okay, but I didn't think this was okay. I thought, what's going on here? There's a lot of people with terrible disability. We don't seem to really understand what's going on. We're just saying it's psychological, and we're not really thinking about it at all. So that's where we were. There were people doing some research, but hardly anyone, to be honest. And I think this is where this stigmatized history of FND is where a lot of the problems come when patients still when they go and see health professionals. So this is
the doctor of a specialist in FND.
I'm going to mute people who are talking. This is survey from FND Hope, just showing how commonly people with FND feel dismissed or disrespected when visiting a health professional. So for those of you not familiar with the history, it's a very recent change that we've gone from saying from how things were to how things are now. I'm gonna run through those changes. So when I started in the 1990s, FND was a condition doesn't really exist, would be, it certainly didn't look like it existed when you opened a book, although when you went to a neurology clinic, it clearly did. Psychiatrists tended to reject patients because they'd heard that diagnosis was often wrong. When you opened a textbook of psychiatry, it would say this is a diagnosis of exclusion that you make when you've excluded all of the other conditions that there are. It was psychological. Neurologists often thought that patients who had FND were probably voluntarily producing their symptoms to some degree. And I think that's probably how many neurologists coped with not really knowing much about it, was they thought, well, this is it's not my problem. It probably is not, you know, maybe the patient's not even got a real problem. So, and they would often say things like, oh, you'll be better in a few months. So I do know this still goes on. I'm not saying it's all in the past, but that this was widespread. This was the mainstream approach back then. And where we are now, mostly, I know we've still got a long way to go, but we've established that it is a common disabling problem. We can make the diagnosis as reliably as any other neurological condition. It's not a diagnosis of exclusion. It's a diagnosis you make because someone has typical features of FND, and that's really important. That still gets missed a lot. People still come to my clinic, saw a patient today, who thought they were being diagnosed with FND because their tests were normal. Well, if they were, that's not how you diagnose it. So you diagnose it because people have typical features. It's a disorder that sits between what we think of as neurology and psychiatry. It's a disorder that defies those categories, to be honest. And it's definitely not malingering. And treatment is desperately needed and can help some people, but we need better treatments. So here's Rachel, who was a university student, and this was her a few years ago now, presenting with some right-sided weakness, a bit like she'd had a stroke. She's got some functional dystonia, and just you can see how disabled she is.
In an ideal health service, all doctors and professionals would be actually made aware of this. We wouldn't be treated as though, not like we're faking, but almost like as though it's not real. And that doesn't really help us because we're thinking, oh, what's wrong with me? So
yeah, what's wrong with me? It's interesting. She said treating like we're not like we're faking, but not like it's real. So I think a lot of people feel like they're in that in-between zone where they're not really sure if the person in front of them really believes them, even though they might not be accused of being outright of faking. So it was kind of thought to be, I thought someone's put in the chat, is it rare? It's not rare. It's common and disabling. These were two of my supervisors. At the bottom there, Michael Sharp and Charles Waller, and Alan Carson was also supervised for them. He's been my colleague in neuropsychiatry over this whole time, and it's really been incredibly important that we've been able to do this work together. One neurologist, one psychiatrist, working together, breaking down those barriers. And Alan led this study where we looked at nearly 4,000 new outpatients across Scotland. So what are neurologists doing? And one of the most common things they're doing is seeing people with functional disorders, a whole range of things. And FND, depending how you count it, is in there at like 6% or up to 16%, depending if you count things like dizziness and cognitive symptoms. So it's really not a rare problem at all. It's a pretty common one, actually. And probably anything from 50 to 100,000 people in the UK have FND. But you wouldn't know that really when you think about other conditions that have a similarly common, like MS, for example, is probably quite similar to that. But most people have heard of MS, but people haven't heard of FND. That's because of this history. That's why we're in that situation. Now, what about the diagnosis? We did some studies of that to show that actually misdiagnosis is terrible when anyone's misdiagnosed in either direction. You don't want to be told you've got FND if you've got MS, but also you don't want to be told you've got MS if you've got FND, because the treatments are different. Now, and doctors do get it wrong, and here's some studies showing that the frequency of misdiagnosis hasn't been that different since about 1970, really. So we've studied this quite a lot. There's no reason to be complacent, and for every individual with a misdiagnosis, that's the tragedy. But it's no different to other conditions. People get misdiagnosed with MS and motor neuron disease and epilepsy. So that's not a reason to ignore the problem, whereas it was before. And it's a diagnosis of inclusion, which I've said, it's such an important point here. So here's Rachel. And what I'm doing here is a test called a hip abductor sign. It's a diagnosis you make because someone has typical clinical features of the condition. In her case, and you'll see this in people with FND causing movement problems, voluntary movements are usually impaired in some way. There's either people can't move or there's too much movement. but the automatic movements are much better. So it's that difference between voluntary movements and automatic movements that tells us that this is not damage to the nerves or the brain, but it is a problem with the functioning of the nervous system. So that's why it's called functional neurological disorder. So can I just get you to push against my hand here? We can see when we do that, you're stronger than I am, and I can't push that knee in. And then let's try and do the same thing with this knee. So stop me from pushing in, push out as strong as you can. But I'm winning there, pushing your knee in. Let's go back to this side. I want you to push out again as hard as you can. Really stop me, push, 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 push. Now when we do that, we can see that actually what's happening over on the right side is that it's become much stronger and I can't push the knee in now. So it's brought out the automatic movement. So I spend a lot of time with patients showing them how I'm making the diagnosis. This is often a light bulb moment for people because you realize it's not about the normal scan or the normal test. It's about the fact that we're finding something really interesting and unusual that's going on in the body. The person can't move. The more they try to move, the worse it gets. But their automatic movements are fine. So that's telling us something very interesting about the mechanism of these symptoms in the brain. Here's another patient of mine with functional dystonia. You see she's got a very disabling posture of her foot. And here I'm just asking her to close her eyes and tell me what her foot feels like. When you look at the foot, you can see that it's bent, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you just close your eyes for me now? And just tell me what that left foot feels like with your eyes shut.
It feels like it's straight.
Okay. It feels completely straight.
Yeah.
Okay. And then when you open your eyes and you look at it again?
And then I can see it's bent.
Yeah.
Although.
So is that what is that? Is that a strange feeling? That difference between?
It feels strange because although the foot's bent and I know it's bent, when my eyes are shut, it's straight.
So she knows it's bent, but when she closes her eyes, her foot feels straight. That's really strange, isn't it? And it's telling us there's a problem with the map of her body inside her brain. So her brain thinks it's straight, and in fact, that's why it's sitting like that, because it's sitting in what the brain thinks is the normal position. So something's become distorted in that internal brain map that we all have in this particular symptom. And I could show you lots of others. So I didn't want to show you a seizure tonight, but seizures have their own typical features in functional seizure. There's a whole list of them: functional cognitive problems, functional tremor, functional gait problems. They all have functional visual problems. They all have things that we should look for and be able to show patients. So what about this business of it being a psychological problem? If someone could keep an eye on the muting, because that would be good. So it's very much a disorder that is both at the interface between what we think of as neurology, psychiatry. Now, someone asked me to write a paper on the word non-organic, which is a word that doctors have been very commonly using to apply to this disorder and others as well that you can't see on a test. And I pointed out with this that the word non-organic is just a complete nonsense. Yet human beings are entirely organic. You can't have a non-organic condition if you're a human being, because we are just made of organic stuff. And so doctors who use the word non-organic they're just not thinking about it clearly at all. And here we put a couple of pictures of turnips with apologies, but we were just saying you can't have a picture of a non-organic turnip. It's philosophically impossible. So at a very simple level, these ideas that you can have a non-organic problem just as a nonsense. And then when you think about it, if someone's got weak arms or legs or seizures, what organ in the body is that going to be? It has to be the brain. Of course it's happening in the brain. So again, at a very simple level, when people first started doing the brain imaging studies of FND, and that was in the very late 90s, there was a kind of, oh my goodness, you can see FND in the brain. Well, where else did you think it was going to be? So of course it's a brain condition. Now, that doesn't mean that psychological factors are not relevant, because that goes on in the brain too, but there isn't a psychological bit of the brain and a neurological bit. It's just one thing, and it's got a sort of the consistency of blancmange, and it's sitting inside our skulls, and it's incredible that it does all the things it does. So there are changes in brain function in people with functional disorders. So here's a patient with hemisensory disturbance who feels funny all down one side. Nothing to see on a normal scan, structural scan, but a functional brain scan shows an area that's not working properly, that corresponds with the patient's symptoms. These kinds of functional MRI are not yet available or really reliable in terms of being a test. Some people say, could I have a functional MRI to prove I've got FND? Well, you don't need one, because I believe you anyway, but actually we can't use these yet clinically. But on a research basis, we're learning a lot about which bits of the brain are going wrong in FND. We're not there yet, but we're learning a lot about it. But just because we can see it in the brain and it is a brain condition does not mean that some of the things that people have noticed about FND are not true. So we noticed that people who have FND are much more likely to have experienced stressful events in their life, previous traumatic events. It is probably about 3 times more likely than the general population. So, but that means it's a risk factor, but it's not the cause. So it's a bit like if you're thinking about heart attacks, why do people get heart attacks? Well, some of them have been smokers, but smoking isn't the only thing that causes heart attacks. You would ask about it, but it's not the only thing. So that's where we are with stress and psychological factors. Stress, trauma affects the brain. It changes the brain too. And we've learned that having another neurological condition or medical condition is just a stronger risk factor. So migraine, epilepsy, we've learned more about joint hypermobility, autism, ADHD are all things that make people more vulnerable to getting FND. There's a whole range of things that happen. And some people don't have any risk factors. It just happens. I've met people with no stress, no physical injury. It just happens. Anyone can get FND. I could get FND. Anyone can. And for just people who wanted something a bit more complicated to look at, this is how complicated it gets. When we're thinking about what causes FND, it's a whole load of things. So there's predisposing factors, there are triggering factors which vary depending on the condition. There are what we talk about comorbidities like anxiety, which is very common, but again, not everyone has it. And then things that make it last, perpetuating factors. So being treated badly, not being given access to treatment, being put on medication that might make things worse. So I didn't want to, I realized a lot of my slides were rather simple. So I just wanted to sort of make it clear that there is complexity here and everyone's different. I mean, I don't need to tell this audience FND is not malingering, but you wouldn't believe how many neurologists in the past have had that vague suspicion. And it's, so we wrote this article, I wrote it with Mark Edwards and Mahinda Yogaraja, why FND is not feigning or malingering, for Nature Reviews Neurology. So I was very pleased that we got this out. And what we did was laid out the scientific evidence for why it's not feigning, it's not malingering. I mean, there was lots of it, in fact, including how consistent it's been over time and across the world. Wherever I go in the world, it looks the same, basically. And lots of neuroscience reasons why feigning or malingering just doesn't stack up as an explanation for FND. It would be impossible for someone to feign some of these results that we've got from these neuroscience experiments. So just moving on to treatment, as I said, people used to say, just say to the patient they'll get better in a few months and be optimistic and everything will be all right. Well, that's what people used to say, and and then because they discharged the patient, they never found out a lot of the time. This was a study that I did for my 20 years ago now, but then following people up for 14 years to see what happened to their symptoms. And it's not great, to be honest. I hate to say that to this audience, but I think people probably know this, that this is probably an relatively untreated group of people. And if you're looking 14 years down the line, lots of people still saying that their symptoms are there they are same, sometimes worse as well. So I think the idea that you should say to people, oh, don't worry, it's just going to get better, is clearly a wrong one. So I made this website, which was mentioned earlier, Neurosymptoms, in about 2009. That was before we had any patient charities, when even the research community was pretty small, to be honest. And I made it to help my own patients because I was struggling to get across all the information. I also realized the more information I gave people, the more empowered they were with their own self-management and treatment. And that's been updated recently, and there's a thing called an FND formulator there that you might be interested in, which helps work through this sort of complex maze of causes and helps people think through, well, what's caused my FND? Because everyone's a bit different and everyone has a slightly different pattern of symptoms. So you might want to try that. It produces a report which you can take to your doctor. And there are videos to help you understand what FND is and how it's diagnosed. And there's an app too. But I'm also aware, and this is from Kim and FND Action. Thank you, Kim. I use this a lot in my talks, as you can see. That a lot of people, when this came out, it was like the first time neurologists had something they could do for patients. Hang on a second. And they still do this a lot. They scribble the name of the website on a newspaper, and instead of saying your scan's normal, goodbye, they say, well, you've got FND, here's a website, goodbye, which I realize is only marginally better. So many of you may have had that experience. So giving someone a website is not enough. It's not treatment on its own. And we demonstrated that with a randomized trial where we showed that giving people a brilliant website, this was in the Netherlands actually, made no difference to outcome at 6 months. Why would it? It's just information. Information does help. And I think some people can use that to improve, but it's usually people need much more than that. And we've put together over time, we've had to build this up from a very low base. So we didn't really know what the physiotherapy should look like, or the occupational therapy. So we've described it in all of this series of publications where people coming together saying this is what we found has worked. For physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, psychological therapy. And here's Miranda, who's a patient with functional gait disorder, who made this brilliant short film about her experience.
My mum was there filming at the time, and she thought that it was crazy. And then he just made it faster and faster, and that's when we discovered that I could run. I could go quickly, but not slowly.
So you didn't see the gait, her problem much at the beginning there, but you'll see it just briefly here.
Sam and I.
Oh, sorry. It was at the beginning. She's got a terrible gait problem. She can hardly walk.
My mum was there filming at the time.
But what she discovered in physiotherapy was that her running program was okay. So her walking program was corrupted, but her running program wasn't. So she used running, going fast, to actually regain her ability to walk over about 8 weeks.
We were in depth conversation, and then it wasn't until we were halfway down the street that we both realised that I was walking like normally.
That is a miracle.
And my biggest fear then was to stop walking. I just kept walking because I was like, if I sit down and stop, what if I can't walk again?
So her brain was, scrambled in terms of her ability to just walk normally, but her ability to run was there. So that was the physiotherapy for FND we think is different to what you would do with someone with stroke. You wouldn't put someone with a stroke on a treadmill and think that they might be able to run when they can't walk. So there are very, very important differences, and I should be clear to this audience. I know this is an unusual situation, and most people with FND who can't walk can't run either. So I'm not suggesting you should all just go on a treadmill. Psychological therapy, incredibly important still. This is Kinjal, who's a psychologist I know in India, who is interested in FND there. And we are developing lots of evidence for how this can benefit people with FND, particularly for seizures. We think functional seizures in FND are quite similar. They have overlap with panic attacks in terms they're not the same as panic attacks, but the treatment for them relies on some similar principles, because they're both disorders. People are getting sudden, unexpected, overwhelming symptoms that they're not in control of, and you're helping them to get control back. Many people with FND do have terrible and distressing psychiatric problems, depression, PTSD, panic, and you need to, treating those can actually help treat the FND as well, can help the brain work better again. This is Claire Nicholson, who's an occupational therapist in London and led our occupational therapy guidelines. I met a patient today who hadn't seen for a long time, who was in a terribly disabled state last year with fatigue and something called orthostatic intolerance. She couldn't sit up. And she was saying that the OT that she saw was absolutely transformative. She was just so full of praise for this OT, because what she'd done is help her very slowly over a period of many months, sort of rehabilitate, retrain her brain so that she could tolerate being upright. And she's gone from being hardly able to stand to being able to do most normal things, go to work, take her kids, etc. So OT can be incredibly helpful for some people. And this is Jan Baker, who's a speech therapist in Australia, who led our speech therapy guidelines. Again, it's different treating speech FND problems to other types of speech. You have to almost trick the brain, but you do it in a way which is transparent with the patient. And I'm aware that lots of people have pain, for which we do now have better treatments and information. Our understanding of what chronic pain is has really transformed as well in the last few years, I would say. Some other resources. This is My FND app, which you might have come across, which is really a different way of looking at self-help, and really I recommend it. This is our book, FND Stories. Came out fairly recently, written stories from patients and health professionals. And this book, which is free on the Neurosymptoms website, is a graphic novel describing someone's experience with having functional seizures. So you might find those helpful. So we've gone from this in the 90s, lots of very negative things about FND, to really turning these round to something completely different. So it's a big sea change. We're turning around a super tanker, and we're making good progress. We're not there yet, but we have begun to turn it round. And just in the last few minutes, where are we heading with FND? Well, I firmly believe that patient organisations and advocates are the key to the future of FND. I do not think that any of the things that we're doing with research or trials, that we can do them without doing it together. I'm not just saying that because of this audience. I notice, I can see what a difference it makes. So if any of you here are volunteering in these organisations, thank you. This is making a massive difference. Even though these organisations are still relatively small by medical patient charity standards, they're making a massive difference. So thank you. On a health professional side, we're also getting our act together. So we held this conference in 2017, and then we started the FND Society, which is an international society for health professionals, in 2019. Here it is here. And it astonishes me, really, that we've gone from a position where it was invisible to now FND is regarded as a mainstream condition in UK and certainly in UK neurology and many other countries in the world as well. So I wanted to show you these. Wouldn't normally get excited by the European training requirements for neurology, but I am excited because FND has suddenly appeared in there when it wasn't there before as one of 17 core topics. In the UK one, it wasn't there. It was virtually invisible, and now it's one of 8 core topics. So there is a kind of a systems change going on behind the scene that many of you won't have noticed, because if you're seeing older neurologists, they won't necessarily be that interested. But it has changed. I was very pleased to be on Jeremy Vine talking about FND on Tuesday for half an hour. He had a half-hour session on FND. Again, unthinkable 10 years ago. And it was a great session, thanks to all those involved, including Tom, I think, who's on the call. So here's our conference we're going to have in Verona. I'm secretary of this organisation, and I'm very glad that we're able to offer membership to non-health professionals if they want. It's called community access. It's at the top here. I think we should, if people want to join it's a professional society. So we're talking science, we're talking about research. It's not designed for people with FND, but if people with FND want to join, they can, and they can listen to lectures, they can come to our meeting. So it's open to everyone. And this was our you heard from FND Portal earlier, who has been a brilliant advocate for FND. And I wanted to show you this picture of him having a standing ovation at our meeting in Boston in 2022, which I thought was a really fantastic moment for the topic, where we've gone often, doctors staring at patients or looking at them, to actually listening to them and what they've got to say and working with them as partners. So, and where are we going with research? In lots of directions, and we can talk about these with the Q&A, but I wanted to say thank you to any of you out there that helped with our recent women's health study. We're always advertising on Twitter and social media for studies. We're so grateful for everyone that takes part. These really make a difference when you take part and give us your data. This was the first time anyone studied pregnancy in FND. How will things be in 20 years with FND? Well, it may be that we can do a functional brain scan and diagnose FND, because here's Selma Abet from Switzerland and Samantha Weber actually doing this and showing with 72% accuracy they could tell the difference. So they're definitely heading in that direction. Got new treatments, digital treatments, electrical stimulation treatments, virtual reality people are working on, psychedelics people are tentatively working on. Don't go and pick up, don't go and take mushrooms for seeing this, right? But we're going into this very carefully, seeing if it might be helpful. We're interested in the genetics of FND. People are doing, it's undoubtedly going to have a genetic component, but it's not hereditary. We're interested in how the brain talks to the rest of the body, not just the arms and legs, but the heart, the gut, breathing are all relevant. And we're learning a lot about these sorts of problems that we think are much more important than FND than we realized. Developmental differences like autism, joint hypermobility, which 1 in 5 people have, but probably is a risk factor. The autonomic nervous system, the immune system are all involved. And we always knew they were likely to be, but we're starting to look at that. Now, so you could look at that, so that's great. Okay, haven't things changed a lot? But I'm aware that people listening to this will be day to day having these experiences. I can't find anyone who can help me. I'm on a waiting list. I've actually had really upsetting experiences with health professionals, not good ones, or I've done everything, I've had good treatment, but actually still things aren't better. So I wanted to balance up a bit of this optimism with some awareness that things are very difficult for a lot of people with this condition still. So here's our research group. We're a multidisciplinary group of neurologists and psychiatrists. This was our away day that was funded by a very generous donation by somebody so thank you to them. And that's a QR code if you want to download some of this scientific material, and I'll leave that up for a bit. Or if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's where you can hear about things that are going on in FND along with other people. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I run over a bit. Hopefully we've got time for lots of questions.
Thank you, John. That was brilliant. Thank you very much for all of that. It was absolutely fantastic. So we've had quite a few questions submitted. I know I sent you some over, and I do believe you've covered quite a few of the questions in your talk. So I'm going to try and find some that maybe you haven't covered. So I said there's quite a few, and I know there's quite a few in the questions as well. There's one question here. Are there any known links between FND and hormones?
It's not really been properly studied. I mean, the answer will be yes, there is, because the brain's covered in hormone receptors. You can't really have a disorder of the brain without there being a sort of hormone angle. It's an interesting question about why is it that 75% of people with FND, 70 to 75% are women. And people have often thought, well, is that because women have had more adverse experience? They have, actually, statistically. but I think it's probably more than that, and hormones might be an important part of that. So people are also looking at cortisol, stress hormones, which are kind of interesting in FND in terms of how people experience stress. They may experience it in a different way. Often they experience it in a way where they don't feel stressed, even though other people think they should be. So lots of interesting angles there, yeah.
Thank you, John. Are there any current studies for anti-inflammatory drugs on the brain to ease some FND symptoms?
They're not, because, and I think actually it's pretty unlikely that anti-inflammatories would ease the symptoms. Now, I'm saying that based on people looking at studying anti-inflammatories for kind of related types of functional disorder. So although we see immune, I don't know whether they mean anti-immune, immune drugs, although we see some subtle immune changes, they're probably secondary to the brain problems. Oh, somebody's sharing something. Rather than a primary autoimmune condition. So I think we're probably not going to find the answer in changing the immune system, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Can acupuncture help with FND?
It can, yeah, and I've definitely met people where they found acupuncture helpful. I met one today. There isn't any good clinical trials to tell us whether that's a good thing to do or not. It is quite difficult doing trials in FND. When you're dealing with a disorder of the brain function like this, you do have to be wary of the placebo effect. So this is an effect where if you really want a treatment to work and someone else wants it to work, then it might just work. And that doesn't mean that the problem's all in the mind. When a placebo effect is working, it's activating a whole series of chemicals and pathways in the brain that actually change the brain. So that can make it challenging to do clinical trials. But we don't have good evidence for acupuncture at the moment. Well, there is more evidence for pain.
Thank you. Another question. Every night around 7:30 p.m. I lose the power in my legs, which makes walking very difficult. Are there any strategies that could help with this?
Yeah, so some people do have remarkably sort of regular symptoms, which is kind of interesting to me. I had a patient who had seizures every 90 minutes, almost without fail, and we were sitting there in the clinic waiting for it to happen, and it did. I think what we think is going wrong in FND is your brain has sort of predicted or decided that certain things are happening in a way that you're not in control of at all. And so if it happens at 7:30 every night, that may be the case. What I would do in that situation is look to see whether you could start to interfere with the process. So I don't want to give this person individual advice because I don't know their story.
Yeah.
But in a general terms, if you're having a sudden episode of FND, like paralysis or seizures, then your brain's attention or brain's focus is typically going inwards, and you might be sort of disconnecting a bit in some way, either from your legs or your whole body if you're having a seizure. And the treatment of that is to try and push against that in the other direction by focusing on the external world, talking to someone, listening to a favorite song, playing a game. It's a really hard thing to do, but it's called sensory grounding. You can read about it on the treatment of functional seizures page. And that's sometimes a good starting point to see, can you push against it? Everything in your body and brain will be telling you that it doesn't want to do that. It just wants the symptom to happen. So it's really hard to do it on your own. I think that's why you need guidance. But
yeah.
Hope that
Thanks,
helps.
John. Somebody sent in a question. I am interested in your opinion of the book called It's All in Your Head by Dr. O'Sullivan, and her explanation that FND is purely psychosomatic illness and results of subconscious mind. Thank you.
So Suzanne does have, certainly when she wrote that book, did have that view, and I think and I disagree with her. Suzanne actually trained at the same time as me, and I think the book was actually quite popular with The Guardian and places like that, but the title was just incredibly off-putting to patients. I think there's actually some really beautifully observed cases there in terms of she does been listening to her patients. But what that book shows me is a neurologist who is just at sea with trying to help people. So she describes how she's telling people this is a psychological problem. What do? They get really upset and they walk out of the door. So that's in the book. I think her second book, which I've forgotten, The Sleeping Beauties, she shows that she's there's a slightly different view there of FND, and I would recommend that as in terms of how does our world around us and our society influence symptoms in certain ways. Yeah, interesting question. Thank you, Suzanne. If you're listening, apologies, but I think we've had this discussion quite frankly between us as well.
Thank you, John. That's great. There was one more question that I was going to ask you from our list. See if I can find it. Sorry, my dog just started barking, so I quickly had to mute and go and shut the back door. There was one regarding, let's just see if I can find it. Why is FND not listed as a medical condition on the NHS website where you can look up an A to Z of medical recognised conditions?
Yeah, good question. It is in Scotland. So in Scotland, we have a different, for some weird reason, we have a different NHS information website called NHS Inform, and I wrote the FND page with them. It's got loads of detail, and that's so I've been trying for years to get the English one to do that. They said they weren't putting new conditions on, and yeah, it's just really bad that it's not there. So I'm told someone might have finally made some progress with this. So I hope maybe that will change. But yeah, just go to NHS Inform and type FND, and you'll see how it should be, what it should look like.
Brilliant, thank you,
Yes.
John. Okay, should we move to some people have got their hands up. Elaine, would you like to ask a question?
My question is processing disorder linked with FND in terms of what the brain's processing when, like, the movement of the body,
How you process things.
it's like how, like, I process things, so like the body's not processing things. If it's like saying, like, if your arm's moving but your body is not processing that it's moving,
Yeah. So
could that be linked to FND?
yeah, so it depends what kind of process. So there are sensory processing disorders and auditory processing, visual processing. Some of those are developmental conditions that you see in children. Some of them are linked to other developmental differences like autism. I think we've got to be careful not to call all things that go wrong in the brain FND, but actually we have found that there is a link between people who have those developmental differences. They're probably overrepresented in people who develop FND symptoms. So there's something about them that where their brains are intrinsic, already having some difficulty sending messages, if you like, to parts of the body.
Thank you, John. Okay, the next person with the hand up is Lou. Lou, would you like to ask a question?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, I had a car accident and I was complaining of symptoms in my rib cage and my shoulder, and it went under the radar for a long time, and I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and they said it was mental health, and no one really checked it. And then finally scanned it, and they found that there were some structural changes in the muscle shown as white fatty deposits. And I was told it was a structural change. But then since reporting that to the neurologist dismissed it and then said it was FND.
So I can't give advice about individual histories. What I would say is that what I've explained is FND's a diagnosis that you make on the basis of typical clinical features. So I have patients who have FND, but they also have sciatica, or they also have MS. I have patients with functional seizures and epileptic seizures. So just because someone's found something on a scan that might be relevant to the symptoms doesn't mean that you can't also have FND. So in that situation, you need to go back, people need to go back to their doctors and say, well, why are you saying it's FND? Can you show me the evidence for it? You know, show me my Hoover sign or my tremor entrainment test, or talk me through my typical features of my seizures. That would be my general advice.
Okay, thank you.
So I keep losing my picture and I'm trying to find myself to unmute myself. I'm just trying to go back through all of there was so many questions on the chat. I was just trying to go back through to take one more. Hannah, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, do you find mainstream psychological services are sufficient, or would you recommend referring to neuropsychology services?
Well, I think it depends where you are, and it's not so much about the service, it's the person, isn't it? So I find, I mean, obviously the psychologists I work with know a lot about FND, and if you're a psychologist, it's hard to keep up with everything. So there is an advantage to that. But I've also found that when people working in other mainstream areas of mental health can be incredibly effective for people with FND, and often I find myself ringing them up and speaking for 5 or 10 minutes, just explaining how the therapy can be altered, and then they'll often say, oh well, yeah, okay, I know about that, I can see how that would fit in. So I don't think we need to do it. It frustrates me in a way that I know many mainstream psychology services will say, oh, we don't do that, we don't know about that. My frustration there is that you can know about it. It's not that complicated. There's a fairly basic sort of amount to learn about it. So, but at the end of the day, you want to be treated by someone that's interested in what's wrong with you, that understands that psychological treatments can help, not just you cope with FND, but help you with the actual FND symptoms. So we've got a lot of work to do to get that out there. But you could also tell them the FND Society has a 15-hour course now for psychological therapists. It costs $15. So there you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I have a question for you. What are your feelings on patients being diagnosed with FND and consequently being prescribed anti-epileptic drugs for their functional seizures?
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding there, because if you're diagnosed with FND, functional seizures, you shouldn't be given anti-epileptic drugs. You should only be given those who've got epilepsy. So I'm not sure what's gone wrong there. There are people who have been told they've got diagnosed with epilepsy by mistake, and that is actually much more common than the other way around, who end up on drugs for epilepsy when they've got FND. So then you need to make the right diagnosis and take them off those drugs, usually, unless they're being used for something else.
Oh, thank you, John. Another one, should neurologists be retrained to what we know about the condition now with all the new developments?
So what I would say is they are. So what I showed you is 2 amazing, changes in terms of FND being in the core curriculum for all neurologists. I think I know that when people go out there, it feels like it's not happening, but these things happen really slowly. There is a sort of truth in not being able to teach an old dog new tricks. So if someone's been practicing in a certain way for 20 years, it's hard to change them. FND appears at all of the major neurology conferences now, and in all textbooks and journals. So it's out there. It's just a case of whether people who are willing to change or adapt their practice.
Thank you, John. Another question. Hi, can I ask what your thoughts are on the links between FND and the adrenal system?
Well, that's similar to the question earlier about hormones, because
Yeah.
So the adrenal system is the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal, and it's to do with cortisol. These are the sort of stress hormones. So there are some probable differences there, and people are studying them, but it's not at a level where it's changing therapy yet.
Thank you. Is there a proven common pathway to recovery? We've had diagnosis from 2 neurologists, but neither of them have given a prognosis of recovery plan.
Yeah. Now, giving someone a prognosis, that's telling someone what's going to happen, is really difficult in FND. And I'm still really careful with that, because we've learned from the studies that it's pretty hard to predict who's going to do well with treatment. I'm often surprised by who does really well, or I'm surprised by someone I think is going to do really well, and actually they find it very difficult to benefit from treatment. So when a doctor appears to be hedging and saying, you've got the potential to get better, or these are treatments that help some people, I think that is the correct way of saying it. I know that's really frustrating as a patient. You just want someone to say, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to be better in 8 weeks. That's what you want. But that's not realistic. And imagine if you do all those things and then you're not better, you're going to feel very let down. So I think these are treatments that can help. And you just want to sort of max out on all of the relevant bits. Make sure that you're confident about your diagnosis, that you have a good relationship with the team that you're working with. These things all help. But yeah, and I wish I could say differently. I wish I could say here's the treatment, but there aren't really quick fixes for FND, but there are slow fixes which help a lot of people, I think, but not everyone.
Thank you, John. Just take another question from Katie Rogers.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I hope it's not a daft question. My daughter is 15 now. She was diagnosed in October 22. Since July of last year, she's been reliant upon a wheelchair, unable to walk. And then suddenly, out of the blue, about 3 weeks ago, brilliant news, she came home from school and said, I've taken a step. And then she did 3 more steps, not very kind of stable when she's standing on her feet, but leaning down on my arms, she has taken those steps. And we keep doing that every night just to reinforce to the brain that this is okay, we can do this, it's not causing any damage, etc., etc. All what we've been taught to do through cognitive behavioural therapy. But the one thing that I find hard to understand is that obviously with the CBT, you're constantly being told about using distraction techniques. Now, it's quite clear when my daughter is trying to make those steps, she's not using distraction technique. You can see that she's really, really concentrating on making that step. So it's just kind of understanding how that can be, because obviously, you know, I've been taught by the sessions with the psychologist, thinking about distraction, and yet that, you know, that has helped in other respects. But with this, my daughter's not really distracting, you know, she's really having to think, and it's still letting her do that. It's not stopping her.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, John.
No, it does. Yeah. So sorry to hear about your daughter, Casey, but great that she's making some progress. Yeah, I think it's too simplistic to say, you know, physio is all about distraction. It's not. Distraction is a useful tool, I think, particularly early on when you're trying to understand what kind of disorder you've got. And what I showed you with Rachel's hip abductor sign is a sort of distraction. I would say it's more like automatic movements are better than voluntary ones. But I think when you're beginning to improve, there are different pathways whereby that, you know, what she's probably doing is she's, you know, bits of her normal voluntary movement are coming back now. So she's able to use voluntary movement. And I know exactly what you mean about people really concentrating and moving. So that's not necessarily bad. As long as she's getting, if something different is happening and she's moving, great. I think we need lots of different perspectives, and there's lots of different ways in to restoring better and more normal automatic movement. It's not, and so it's not just about distraction. Definitely, you can't spend all day in a state of distraction either.
No.
So it's just one way in, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've just got one more question from Jess, who would like to ask you a question. Jess, are you there? I know.
You're mute, Jess. You're muted, Jessie.
I'm sorry, I can't see her. Oh, there you are, Jess.
Yeah, she's muted.
There you go, Jess. Need to unmute yourself. Turn your mic on.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry. I just want to ask a question. If you have met anyone like me, what I'm going through. So I'm not usually like this. And I got FCD. They got diagnosed, when was it? Couple of weeks ago. And I liked a child. And it goes on for days or weeks.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask if you know anyone else or anybody on here that's experienced it.
So Jessie, I have that is something I've experienced. It is more unusual. Some of us, if you heard Jeremy Vine on Tuesday, one of the patients there was Zoe, who has talked about her foreign accent. She suddenly started speaking a Welsh accent. So she had a kind of change of identity that she wasn't expecting. And I've also had patients like yourself who've developed a sort of a child accent, basically. And also then a change of identity, sometimes feel like they're a child again. So there's often some really interesting things going on in the brain there. We talk about dissociative identity changes.
And is it normal to go in and out of it?
Yes, that happens a lot. So yeah, what you're describing, again, I don't want to have to be really clear to this audience. I don't want to be making diagnoses or recommending treatment to individuals.
Yeah.
Also, but by the way, I don't have a private practice, so I can't see anyone from NHS Edinburgh. I'm sorry, but yes, Jessie, that does happen. I've seen that many times before.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, John, so much for your talk today. I'm going to wrap it up now because otherwise we're just going to keep going over. I think I said you've covered a lot of the questions that was pre-submitted within your talk. Okay. So also for people that did not catch all of it or may it's all being pre-recorded, it's all being recorded, so you are able to catch it up on catch up. But thank you, John, so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. And I'd just like to say thank you so much to FND Action and FND Dimensions as well for all your hard work over the past day and the last few months as well, because we do continue to collaborate on many things as well. So thank you so much. Can we all give everybody a round of applause, please?
Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get around to everyone's questions.
I think we would have just been here for days.
Yeah, okay. Have a look on the website. You might find the answer on the website or on Twitter.
Yeah. So we've got neurosymptoms, John's neurosymptoms website, and of course go to the charity websites for your local support as well. And yeah, is Steve, Kim, did you want to add anything?
No, just huge thanks as well from us at FND Dimensions and to you, Mandy, and all our friends for the support today and over the last few weeks. Thanks to Steph and also FND Portal for their talks today, as well as John's. It's been a great day, amazing numbers of people involved, quite staggering. So it just shows how much this is growing each year.
It is, yeah.
Steve, can you just give reference access to the video recordings?
Well, once they're downloaded and then they might need a bit of editing, then they'll go on to the ideas on websites and YouTube accounts where we can. So give us a bit of time and we'll get them out as quickly as possible.
Okay, thanks. And John, reference your presentation. Are you able to share it with us charities?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Thank you. So we've got that as slides. And thank you so much for today, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.